Hey everyone, we're looking at the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system in this lecture. And while two separate systems, they're actually highly connected with one another in a way that I'll show you here in just a second. Okay, so to start, this is the way that I like to think about how these two systems are related. On the one hand, there's the lungs, and on the other hand, there is the body, which would be pretty much everything except the lungs. And then there's the heart that stands in between them. So the heart is a pump that pumps blood throughout your whole body. It's got two jobs. One, it has to send blood to your arms and your legs and your neck and your trunk and your waist. But it also needs to send that blood as well to the lungs, because at the lungs is the site where CO2 is offloaded and oxygen is loaded up. And then it goes to the body where just the opposite happens. O2 is dispensed to the cells and CO2 is taken up. And so there's this connection between your lungs and all the tissues and the cells in your body, and your heart stands the gap between those two. And essentially there are two circuits that are running in and out of your heart. So the way that I like to think about it is I like to divide the heart into two halves. Each side has its own job. And I'm drawing the left side on your right perspective and the right side on your left perspective to get you used to the fact that when you're looking at organs, the left appears to be on the right side and the right appears to be on the left side. So if this wasn't confusing enough, we'll add that little plot twist into the scenario. And this would be the same as like if I'm holding up my left hand in class and you're all looking at me, it looks to me like, it would look to you like my left hand is actually my right hand. Okay, so if you don't believe me, just have somebody demonstrate it for you. All right, but in either case, we have two halves to the heart. And on the top of each half are these chambers called the atria. And on the bottom of the heart, we have these chambers called the ventricles. The atria, their main job is to collect blood, so they're the inlet, blood comes in. And then what they do is they squeeze and they push as much blood as they possibly can into the ventricles, and then when the ventricles contract, they send blood to the places that they need to go. So the ventricles are often considered the working pumps because they're the ones that are sending the blood to a majority of the different places in your body. The atria are considered the priming pumps because they essentially just gather the fluid and then squeeze it into the ventricles so that they can be as efficient as possible. The atria are somewhat wimpy. If you looked at the muscle wall of an atrium, the muscular wall that surrounds it, it's not very thick. There's not very much muscle there, so they can't generate a whole lot of force. Whereas the wall of the ventricle, that's nice and meaty. That's thick and full of muscle, and so that can cause a pretty powerful contraction to send blood to the different parts of your body. Okay, but in either case, you got the left side and the right side. So what the left side does, it sends blood to your body, which, again, everywhere other than your lungs. And then when it does send that blood to the body, it is oxygen-rich blood. So it's carrying oxygen to the cells and tissues of your body. Now, the blood that's leaving all these cells of your body, this is now oxygen-poor blood, because the oxygen has been delivered to the cells, and now there isn't as much of it remaining in the blood. So then the question remains, where does this blood go? Well, we know it needs to get back to the lungs, because that's where it's going to get some oxygen again. And a common error that students make is they think that it goes straightway to the lungs, which would make sense. I mean, you got to get oxygen, so send it to the blood to get that oxygen. The problem is that the blood that's leaving the heart has high pressure to it. By the time it's made it all the way to the body, the actual places that it's going to go, the cells and such that it gives the blood, now it's lost a lot of the pressure, actually. So there isn't quite enough pressure to get it all the way then to the lungs and then all the way back to the heart. There's only hardly enough to get it back to the heart. And so that's, in fact, what does happen. This is not the thing that happens. The blood leaving the tissues of your body doesn't go straight away to the lungs. It actually has to come back around to the heart to get re-energized, so to speak, to get more pressure added so that it can make its way then to the lungs. So this represents then what's known as the systemic circuit. Blood leaves the left side of your heart, goes to your body, comes back to the right side of your heart. Okay, now from here, the right atrium can collect that blood. It can squeeze it into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle can contract and send that blood now to the lungs. Remember, this is oxygen-poor blood still. We haven't gained any oxygen since we've left the tissues of the body. And now the only thing that remains is that this blood will gather oxygen and then come back in to the left side of the heart. So now this would be oxygen-rich blood. Okay, so this is called sometimes the figure 8 configuration of the cardiovascular system. You got blood leaving the left side, going to the body, coming back to the right side. Leaving the right side, going to the lungs, coming back to the left side. Leaving the left side, going to the body, coming back to the right side. Leaving the right side of the body, going to the lungs, and coming back to the left side. And it continually does this all the time. Keeps you alive. This circuit, the one that goes from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart, is called the pulmonary circuit. And the word pulmonary is a word we'll become well acquainted with because there's several different structures and things that are called or utilize that word pulmonary. It means lungs. The Spanish word for lungs is pulmones, and so they share a common Latin derivative here, pulmonary. All right, now there are a couple of valves in the heart. There are these valves here called atrioventricular valves because they sit in between the atrium and the ventricle. So this is an AV valve, and they have different names. The one on the left side is called the bicuspid valve. The one on the right side is called the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid means 3 leaflets. Bicuspid means 2 leaflets. So it's a little bit tricky to draw here because I'm not very good at drawing, but like the tricuspid would have a leaflet, and then another leaflet. It'd be 3 little leaflets that close to seal it. This would just be 2 leaflets that close to seal. But regardless of whether there's 2 or 3 leaflets, they do the same thing. They prevent blood from going backwards. So, for example, when the ventricles contract, they squeeze the blood that is in the chamber. Well, when you squeeze fluid inside of a chamber, it builds the pressure. And so when the pressure builds, that fluid is going to want to escape anywhere that it can. There are 2 ways that it could go. There's the inlet and there's the outlet. Well, it would be a really bad design for a pump if every time the chamber squeezed and pushed blood went back from whence it came. We don't want blood to come back from whence it's come. We want it to go from point A to point B, not from point A to point B back to point A again. So the valves, they help to encourage unidimensional perfusion, unidimensional traveling of the blood. It can't go backwards. It is forced. When the ventricles contract, it is forced to go through the outlets to somewhere new. Okay, so it's a really clever little thing here. It makes the heart much more efficient because it's always sending blood from point A to point B, not backwards. Okay, the main outlets then, the vessels, what they're called, that leave the heart. The one that leaves the left ventricle is called the aorta, and the one that leaves the right ventricle is called the pulmonary trunk. Here we see that word pulmonary again, referring to lungs. So anything coming through the pulmonary trunk is going to the lungs. Now keep in mind it doesn't look as simple as I've drawn here, anatomically speaking, but this will be sufficient here just for our class. Okay, now in the outlets then there's another set of valves. These are called the semilunar valves, and their names are really easy to remember because they're named just from the vessel that they sit in. The one that's in the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. The one that's in the aorta is called the aortic semilunar valve, and those also will help another way to encourage blood to go onward to its new destination and not go backwards. All right, now a little note here about the difference between veins versus arteries. Most people make the mistake of thinking that veins are blue and they carry oxygen-poor blood, and arteries are red and they carry oxygen-rich blood. And while that's true oftentimes, it's not always the case. The true convention is that arteries are vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and veins are vessels that carry blood toward the heart. That's the true convention. And if it's oxygen rich, it will be a red color. If it's oxygen poor, it will be a blue color. But like here, we see oxygen rich blood is coming out of the lungs and it's going towards the heart. So these are actually called veins because they're going towards the heart. But they are carrying oxygen rich, so it's actually red. And similarly here, we have blood going towards the heart, so it's also called a vein. And here, the oxygen blood is poor, so this would be blood that's blue. Whereas here we have an artery because it's going away from the heart, but this is oxygen poor blood, so it's an artery that's carrying blue deoxygenated blood. So that whole blue versus red, oxygen rich versus oxygen poor for artery and vein convention doesn't necessarily hold up. But this is the true convention. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood toward the heart. Okay, so there are a couple of different vessels then. Here we're seeing a schematic showing the heart. This is more what it looks like. The first big vessel coming off the heart we said is the aorta. And off of the aorta there will be branches and branches and branches, so they'll get smaller and smaller as they branch off the main vessel of the aorta. So they'll branch into large arteries, and there's a whole bunch of branches of large arteries, and then off of those we'll get smaller and until eventually we get to the smallest network of tubes, which are called the arterioles. You've got a whole bunch of arterioles going all over your body, and each arteriole is a gateway into what's known as the capillary bed. And this is a super important part of your body because this is the place where nutrient exchange happens. This is the place where the walls are so thin that stuff can actually get out of the blood and into your tissues, and vice versa. Stuff from the tissues can get back into the blood. Okay, then once we get through the capillaries, now we're on the venous side. So we're collecting the blood now and bringing it back to the heart. Well, the smallest of the veins is called a venule, and that would be analogous to the arteriole. A whole bunch of venules will gather together to bring blood into a vein, and a whole bunch of veins will bring blood into the big, largest vein of the body that drains all of the blood from everywhere, and that's called the vena cava. All right, let's take a look then at this capillary bed because there's a lot of stuff happening here. And this is the place where I say there's the great exchange, because this is where life is actually happening on a physiological level. This is where your cells are getting what they need and they're getting rid of what they don't need. And if neither of those things happens, you'll die, right? Your cells, you are a collection of cells, and those cells have to stay happy or they die. And in order for you to be alive and animate this frame of your body that you have to have your cells happy. So they have to be able to participate in this great exchange, and this is where it happens. This is a cartoon of a capillary bed. And the way that I think about it is if like your body was a city and nutrients were delivered via like, you know, the car, like the cars traveling on streets are like the red blood cells and they're carrying nutrients and things. Well, the main arteries and veins in your body would be like the freeways and the highways. And then the arterioles and the venules would be like the smaller county streets, or the bigger boulevard type streets and things, the avenues and such. And then the in between each of the blocks then are all the smaller residential streets where it's a slower speed limit and it's really close to your house. And so that would be like the analogy here of the capillaries. There's this sprawling network of tubes. No cell in your body will be much more than 100 or 200 microns away from a capillary. So they're everywhere. They're microscopic, so you can't see them. But like if you look at your hand, you're probably looking at millions upon millions of capillaries that would be underneath your skin and in your muscle tissue and in your fat tissue and in your wrapping around your nervous tissue. There's no cell in your body that's much further than 100 or 200 microns away from a capillary. In fact, there is so many capillaries in your body This is one of the most mind-boggling statistics in all biology, so pay attention here. This will blow your mind. If you took all of the vessels in your body, so all of these capillaries and all of the arteries and all the veins, line them up end for end, in an average adult, it would be about 60,000 miles of tubing. Okay, just let that sink in. 60,000 miles. And just to give you an illustration of how much tubing this would be, imagine you get on a plane and you fly around the entire world. Okay, you're flying around the world at like 800 miles an hour or more, and it takes maybe like it's like a 22 or 24-hour flight. Okay, and then imagine that super long plane trip. You are unspooling tubing the entire way. It's like this little spool is falling out of the airplane, and so like just every hour of that huge journey, you just got miles upon miles upon miles of this tubing falling to the ground from your airplane. Okay, then travel the world once, and then stay on that plane and travel around the world again. Okay, think about how much tubing that would be, and then try and coil that massive amount of tubing into your body. That is what God has done when He made you. And it all came from one cell. All that tubing arranged throughout all of your body. 60,000 miles of it. Because this is where your cells get their nutrients. This is what your cells need. Your cells don't just like make all of the nutrients they need and they pop out of thin air. They actually require to participate in an exchange with the blood. So that's what's happening in the capillaries. Okay, to perfuse these cells then, there are these little gateways that can open and close to allow blood to pass through. These are called precapillary sphincters. And at times, your cells might need some stuff, and so these would open and blood would squirt through. At other times, your cells are happy, and so then these would shut. The muscles would squeeze and close the tube so that blood doesn't flow through the capillary. So it's not the case that blood is perfusing all of your capillaries at the same time, because you just simply don't have enough blood to pass through 60,000 miles of capillaries all at once. So blood, rather, it squirts through the capillaries in a intermittent, discontinuous fashion, which is known as vasomotion. And here's a little video that shows this. So what you're seeing, this is an arteriole, and this would be like a larger artery. And the arterioles, this would probably be one that's leading into a capillary bed somewhere. They have, surrounding them, rings of muscle, and so when the muscle relaxes, the vessel opens and red blood cells rush through there. So you can see each one of this is thousands upon thousands of little red blood cells, and they just cram through here because they have a pressure that's pushing them through. And then when the tissues are satisfied, then these muscle cells constrict and they shut the gateway off. And then when more fluid is required, they relax and blood just flows through here like a jet stream to perfuse all of the tissues. And then they've had enough nutrients, now it closes shut again. So this is how blood is flowing through the microanatomy of your body, every last little nook and cranny everywhere. And it just pulses, the blood pulses through this thing called vasomotion through the capillaries. And I just totally geek out about this stuff. I could just watch, I could watch red blood cells flowing through tubes, opening and closing, like all day. It's just, I love it. It's so cool to me. Look at all those cells just flying through there. All right. Okay, so that's a little bit about how blood flows through. Now, another curious thing that happens is that there is pressure inside of this fluid, and that pressure will cause fluid to actually leave the vessels. So capillaries can be of 3 different kinds, and they all vary in how many holes they have in them. So some of them are designed to be somewhat leaky, and even the most tightly woven together capillaries still are a little bit leaky. So fluid can actually get out of these things. which is good because that's what allows the fluid to get to all of your cells. Well, if you were to tally up how much fluid is lost out of a capillary bed towards the origin of the capillary bed, which would be called the proximal end of it, it's about 24 liters a day of fluid. In all of your capillary beds, all out throughout your body, there's about 24 liters of fluid lost out of the capillary bed. Well, on the other side then of the capillary bed, towards the venous side, if you were to accumulate and tally up all the fluid that's reclaimed, it's about 20 liters that is reclaimed. Okay, so there's this cool washing of fluid, this microcirculation of fluid that happens that's bathing the cells. The fluid comes out of the vessels, passes along through the capillaries, beds, passes through the cells, and then it returns back into the tube so it can make its way back to the heart. So my question to you then is, you've lost 24 liters here and you've only gained 20 liters here. What happened to that 4 liters? There's 4 liters that's not accounted for. Well, the answer is that there's another little vessel system which is called the lymphatic vessels, and there's a whole nother arrangement of tubes that carry fluid, and that's called the lymphatic system. So these capillary beds usually have some lymphatic capillaries in here, and they're a little bit different because they have these end of the line terminals, and their job is just to seep and collect, or to wick up and collect that 4 liters a day. And this is a great design because what it means is as the fluid circulates through the cells, any sort of cell that's been damaged or any sort of bacterium or virus that's in that fluid that's around in the tissues, if it's there, it'll get swept away into that fluid, and now it will pass in and collect into the lymphatic vessels, and then it will pass through a series of these things called lymph nodes, where there's tons of warriors of the immune system waiting there to destroy anything that might be harmful to you. So it's a good way to continually monitor your body's tissues to make sure it's sterile, make sure there's no pathogens, make sure there's no cells dying, no cancer cells, any of that type of stuff. All right, so the 4 liters a day gets collected in the lymphatic vessels. Now, if these get blocked for any reason, what can happen is that 4 liters can actually accumulate, and so it doesn't get collected. And if it accumulates, it causes swelling, and this is a condition known as lymphedema. Edema is a general word for swelling, and this is swelling that results from the lymph vessels being blocked, and so this is showing an example of that. There's a couple different things that could cause this, but this is a pretty severe case here. Now, there's also some swelling that can happen even if your lymph vessels are intact. There's some swelling that can happen if, for whatever reason, there's more fluid lost. And one of the common examples of this would be during pregnancy. In pregnancy, a woman has to actually make much more blood than she originally had to sustain the growth of the embryo and the fetus. And so it causes more pressure, and when there's more pressure, it actually causes more fluid to be lost here than normal. So there's actually more fluid lost than reclaimed, and so it does lead to some swelling. Specifically, you see it in the ankles and the feet, most often the case, because those are the areas that have the greatest column of gravity, pushing down on and causing more pressure. But that would be more of a reversible thing, because then once the baby is born and then the blood volume goes back to normal, then it's more balanced. But in any case, this has all, like swelling and fluids and tissues, it all has to do with what's going on at the capillary bed. Okay, this is an interesting story that I'm always remiss if I get through the cardiovascular system and I don't talk about it. I call this the tale of Otto Loewi. So Otto Loewi was a German scientist, and he was studying the heart, and specifically, they knew that there were things that they knew that there was a nerve that would attach to the heart, and that nerve was called the vagus nerve, and they knew that the actions of the vagus nerve would either, it would affect the heart rate. It would either speed the heart rate up or slow the heart rate down. What they didn't know is what was the mechanism of action that caused the heart rate to speed up or slow down when the vagus nerve was stimulated. Was it the case that it was an electrical impulse spreading through the myocardium, the tissue, the muscular tissues of the heart? Or was it a chemical substance that the vagus nerve was releasing that was then bathing the heart and then causing its effects? Anyways, this was a big mystery because it had to do with also how nerves act with and engage the tissue that they innervate. This is a great mystery. So he was working on this problem, and he went to bed one day, and he, in his dreamed up the experiment that would be required to solve this riddle. And he was so excited, he woke up and he scribbled it all down in his notebook, and then he fell back to sleep because it was the middle of the night. He's tired. Well, when he wakes up in the morning, he scribbled so frantically that he couldn't read any of his writing. He didn't know what the dream was. And so he had this brilliant experiment to discover this wonderful phenomenon, and he couldn't read his writing. So he goes to bed another night, and much to his luck, he has the same dream, and in it, then he wakes up. He doesn't take any chance on it. He gets up, goes straightway to the lab, performs the experiment, and then discovers the riddle and actually wins a Nobel Prize for his work. So, sometimes Nobel Prize worthy insights can come to you in your sleep while you're dreaming. What his experiment was is he took a heart and he put it in a bath, and he stimulated that heart with the vagus nerve, and then he removed the heart and took the fluid and gave it to another heart. So he took the fluid and put it to another heart that was not attached to the vagus nerve, and it exerted the same effects. So it showed that there was some chemical that the nerve was releasing. That chemical could actually collect into the fluid, and when applied to another heart that didn't even have a vagus nerve, it would exert the same effect. So it showed that it was a chemical nature. And this is now how we know these nerves work, as they release chemicals. They release neurotransmitters that then bind to the tissues and exert their effects. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the respiratory system. The first thing about the respiratory system is how to get air into and out of your lungs. We're breathing all the time, and what is some of the physics behind what's causing that air to go in and go out of your lungs? It has everything to do with volume and how it creates pressure in a closed container, or semi-closed container anyway. So this is showing a picture of your chest cavity, and this muscle right here that you see is the diaphragm. Okay, when your diaphragm is relaxed, it looks something like this. It forms something like a dome. And when your diaphragm contracts, it actually pushes outward and it expands your chest cavity, and also your ribs elevate to some degree, which expand your chest cavity. Well, anytime you expand the volume of container, it makes the pressure in that container less. So if we expand the container of your thoracic cavity, it's going to make like a vacuum in here. There's going to be a pressure that's less inside your thoracic cavity than it is in the atmosphere. And so it does effectively create a vacuum that sucks air into your lungs. And then similarly, when you relax and your ribs depress and your diaphragm retracts, that volume of your thoracic cavity increases, the volume decreases, which actually builds the pressure, and now the pressure is greater in your lungs than it is in the atmosphere. So now it's like a little air gun that's shooting air out. So when your volume expands, it creates a negative pressure like a vacuum, and when your volume shrinks, it builds pressure and almost as like an air compressor. It pushes air out. So that's how air gets into and out. It all has to do with the contraction and relaxation of your diaphragm and some of the other accessory muscles of respiration. Now, where does that air go? This is what we call external respiration. It's the exchange of gases that happens between your blood and the inspired air. And this is occurring at the very final destination, the end of the line, terminus of your journey of air molecules, and it's a little bit hard to understand where that air is going without looking at some of the microanatomy here. So this is a cool set of illustrations that show where that air is going. So this is the trachea. The trachea is the main pipe that brings air into your body, and you can feel the trachea. That's the big pipe that's right on the front of your neck. If you grab it and move your fingers up and down, it feels like little C-shaped rings of cartilage, and you can actually move it around. That's where air is going, and once it gets down into your lungs, it splits, and one goes to one side of your chest, the other goes to the other side of your chest. Okay, then from here, these branches split, and then they split again, and they split again, and they split again, much like the arteries in the cardiovascular system and the veins as well. Well, the final smallest tube is called a bronchiole, and the bronchiole is the gateway that sends air to the final destination, which is the pulmonary lobule. I like to think about the pulmonary lobule being almost like a cluster of grapes. It's all these little spherical cups that are in this sac, and the individual little cups are called the alveoli. Alveoli would be plural, or you could call it alveolus for if you're just talking about one of them. And the alveoli then are the final site, or would be the site of gas exchange. It's the very end of the line for the air that you've breathed. And this is going to be then where you have a lot of blood vessels, and there is going to be an exchange of gases that occurs there. All right, now the microanatomy here is pretty cool. So let me show you a little bit more of a detailed illustration of what's going on here. This is showing us the bronchiole. So this is air that's just been out of your body, and you're breathing it in, and it's going all the way down into these little small crevices here. Well, alveoli are these little spherical cup spaces, and this is designed such that it greatly increases the surface area for absorption, which is really important because you have to have a lot of surface area for gas exchange to occur. The more surface area you have where gas exchange can occur, the more effective this whole system is going to be. Each one of these alveoli has little elastic fibers wrapping around it. Think about it being almost like little rubber bands. And because of that, it actually means that your lung tissue wants to contract. There's elastic tension encouraging that tissue to constrict and recoil and shrink. On the other hand, though, your lungs are always forced to be expanded because they are glued, for lack of a better word, to the walls of your thoracic cavity. So the way that it works is there's the wall of your thoracic cavity, and then there's the lung tissue, or the lobes of your lungs. They're actually stuck to the walls of your thoracic cavity because there's a little bit of fluid in between here, and anytime you have surfaces that have fluid in between them, they usually stick together. So even though these little rubber bands want to make your lung retract and shrink, they can't because it's glued. Okay, but it's great for us because when we breathe and we fill our lungs, that takes effort because you're working against the rubber bands. You're working against the microscopic rubber bands, so it takes effort to breathe. But once you have a full breath, you can sort of just relax, and the lungs will retract on their own. You don't really have to work too hard to cause air to blow out of your lungs. It does that naturally. Furthermore, sometimes if people overexert themselves, or there's a little air that gets put into this connection here between the lobe of the lung and the wall of your thoracic cavity, then it can actually cause a collapsed lung, and it will shrink, and it will shrink to about 10 or 20% of the original volume of the lung. Okay, another feature then of the microanatomy here is that we have lots of vascularization. We have lots of perfusion of blood, tiny little blood vessels covering every last little nook and cranny. So what you're seeing here, this would be a branch of the pulmonary artery, and that would be one of those main vessels leaving the heart. Specifically, the blood that leaves the right side of the heart passes through the pulmonary trunk, and then it comes down here to the pulmonary arteries. So when we said way back at the beginning of this chapter that blood leaving the right side of the heart goes to the lungs, well, here's ultimately a snapshot of where some of that blood is going. It's going to the microanatomy, the small microscopic structures of the lung tissue. So all that blood leaving the right side of the heart will pass through, as illustrated here, some alveoli. And it's just a real quick journey across some alveoli before it's now collected to the pulmonary veins. And this all happens super fast. So you've got a blood vessel traveling a little bit across here, and then, think about a red blood cell inside of this tubing coming down along, and it has just like a millisecond, probably, I don't know how fast this happens, but I'm guessing it's definitely less than a second. I'm guessing it's probably like half of a second or even less than that. A very short amount of time for the red blood cell to pass through the alveolus, and as it does pass through, there's a gas exchange happening. So it looks something like this. You have a capillary passing across. There's more oxygen inside the inspired air, inside the air that you breathed in, and so oxygen diffuses into the blood. On the flip side, the blood that is in, or the red blood cells in the capillaries passing through, they have a higher abundance of CO2 because they've been picking it up from the tissues. So CO2 then diffuses out. This is all called external respiration. Respiration is a general word that refers to any time gas is involved. There's exchanges of gases involved. And this is specifically called external respiration because it's a gas exchange that occurs between atmospheric air that was outside of your body and now is temporarily inside your lungs. So technically, even though it's inside your chest cavity, the air is still considered foreign. It hasn't been absorbed into your body yet. So it's like gas exchange that's occurring between your body and the outside world. So we call it external respiration. In either case, the CO2 that's accumulated comes out here, and the oxygen that's breathed in comes in. Now, the purpose of these gases, why they're important, oxygen is involved in the energy process that your cells employ to make things like ATP. Ultimately, you have sugar molecules and other energy molecules being broken apart, and they are used to make ATP. Well, in that process, there are electrons that are stripped off, and they get fed through this thing called the electron transport chain, and that's what's used to establish a proton gradient, and that's what's used to then drive the whole ATP production machinery. Well, these little loose electrons that are running around, they need to go somewhere. It's not good to have electrons bebopping around and hitting molecules and just running around unchaperoned in your cell. So your cell floods itself with oxygen molecules, and oxygen molecules are electronegative, so they like to soak up electrons. So any of those electrons that are running through the energy-making machinery of your cell, they will eventually land their way on an oxygen molecule, and then also the oxygen molecule will pick up some hydrogen ions and it will make water. So at the end of the day, the reason why you need oxygen is because it's utilized to soak up electrons that are running around in your body that are the result of your energy producing processes in your cell. And then also, when you are making energy, when your cells are making energy, what they do is they take a complex molecule and they break it down into little bits and bits and bits and bits. And eventually, mostly what they do is they take all of the hydrogens and they split them apart into protons and electrons. But a lot of the byproducts then of all of these structural components to the molecules are, well, a lot of these molecules that you use to make energy, they have complex carbon backbones to them. Carbon is sort of like a microscopic, carbon is like forms like a backbone scaffold for a lot of molecules. And so you don't really actually use that to make energy. You can get rid of it. So the way that you get rid of it is it gets broken down and it actually accumulates into this molecule known as CO2. So when you breathe, like if you go and you take a big breath right now, you're breathing out CO2. Well, that CO2 originally was probably an energy molecule. So it's like you're like breathing out right now your cereal that you ate in the morning or your sandwich that you ate at lunch. Uh, your cells take those nutrients from your blood, from your digestive tract, they use it to make energy, and in the process, those energy molecules are broken down into their tiniest bits, and much of the molecules are expired in CO2. So that CO2 gets soaked up by the blood, and if it accumulates to too great of extent, what can happen is CO2 can cause acidosis. It can cause your blood to get too acidic. CO2, if it accumulates, what it does is it reacts with water and it forms carbonic acid. And carbonic acid can associate to make your blood more acidic. And you don't want your blood to be acidic because your blood needs to keep a very narrow pH. If your blood gets too acidic or too basic, your proteins stop working. They're all fine-tuned to a specific condition. And so we don't want CO2 to accumulate. In fact, when you hold your breath, the reason that you feel the urge to breathe is not because you don't have enough oxygen in your body. You've got plenty of oxygen on hand. The reason you feel you need to breathe is because your blood is becoming acidic. And there are chemoreceptors in your brain that can detect that acidosis and will then cause that urge to breathe. Because when we breathe, we get rid of that CO2. The CO2 gets extracted from the blood and then we blow it out. So, two very important processes happening here, all in this really cool interwoven microanatomy. You also see there's some lymphatic vessels here. There's lymph traveling through, and there's some interesting features about the cells lining these alveoli, but we won't get into any of that in this class. All right, so that's external respiration. That's a little bit of the overview of how the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system work together to send blood to your cells of your body. The importance of sending that blood to the cells of your body, one, a great portion of a major reason why it's important is this, to get oxygen to your cells and remove CO2 away from your cells. But then the other would be just to deliver other types of nutrients to your cells, like sugars and vitamins and things like that.